5 minutes or so is a selection of music from Ireland, England, Spain, Europe, the French, Flanders, Belgium sort of area that would have surrounded Owen Roe during his lifetime. We're playing them on copies of instruments from the time. This is, Rachel will talk about hers in a little bit. This is a lute that you may recognise from Robin Hood movies and things like that. This would have been the instrument of Shakespeare's time. And this is a guitar, or a copy of a guitar from the period. A lot of our earliest versions of the harp music at the time actually come from Scottish manuscripts. That the harpers travelled back and forth between Northern Ireland and Scotland. And in Scotland, there's lute manuscripts. The lutenists liked the tunes and wanted to copy them and wrote them down. And that is how we have some of our earliest versions of the tunes. For example, Tuaird the Love, that we'll play in a minute. So these first three pieces are by Ruaidh Dáil Cavan, from the Cavan clan up around the Derry area. And the family were allies of the O'Neills and took part in the 9 Years' War. So for all we know, Owen Roe may have come across. Some of them may have come across Ruaidh Dáil, blind Rory Kane, as he would have been if he had been in the Wild West of America a few centuries later. So we'll play you 2 versions now of Ruaidh Dáil's Sister's Lament. The first one is taken from those lute manuscripts from Scotland, and then again from a Scottish manuscript from later on, a slightly different version, and we're going to follow it then, of course, with the tune you probably all recognise, Tuaird the Love, Ruaidh Dáil's most famous tune.
I'm going to tell you a little bit about this instrument in case you're curious. It looks like a little baby keyboard. This instrument is actually a replica of the Queen Elizabeth virginal that's housed in the V&A Museum in London. I don't have her coat of arms on it, but other than that, it's exactly like it. The Elizabeth herself actually was a very good musician and a virginal player, and these instruments would have been throughout England, lots of countries in Europe, and indeed some here in Ireland. As you'll see later on in the programme, I'm going to play some music that's from the Dublin virginal manuscript, again, all connected at the same time, and this music would have been heard throughout the country in various different settings. If you're familiar with a harpsichord, it's like a baby harpsichord. Originally it had no legs, actually they would have put them on tables and played, and then gradually the legs came in, and it has no loud or soft like a piano. There's tiny little plectras inside that pick it. So you kind of hear us blending the sounds together. In London, and he had his music in many different manuscripts that are in various different museums in Cambridge and Trinity. They are all in existence and they're really important sources. The pieces that we're taking tonight, Down It's Midnight, Fortune My Foe, and Frog Galliard, are actually all found in the Dallas Lute book, which is bound in Trinity. It's actually bound together with the Dublin Virginal manuscript that we're going to play some music from later on. This music was really popular, it was heard everywhere. He was an instant sensation, he was kind of like the Taylor Swift of this era. Even actually, in recent times, Sting did a cover of his Flow My Tears piece. His music has really stood the test of time, but he was really very popular and his music would have been played and sung all around the two countries. So we're going to start with Down It's Midnight, but we'll also then blend it into a little Irish piece called Carolan which is found deriving from Tipperary to The Girl by the River Suir, and it's a little set of variations. Eamon's going to play variations that are in the little manuscript in Trinity, and I'm going to play from a manuscript that's actually housed in Cambridge. We're going to blend the two and have a bit of fun together.
So the strings on this instrument are made of gut and are very sensitive, obviously, then to humidity and everything. So you can help us by breathing as little as possible. So John Dowland was incredibly famous for of his time, so I think it's kind of unquestioned that, especially in the time that Owen Roe spent in Europe, that he would have come across that music. And that last tune he played, the Collino Costurame, they think ended up it was very popular in the English court, and that's where we had that version of it, and indeed these versions of it. Unfortunately, there's no record of the original Irish version of the song, but it turns up in Shakespeare's. It's mentioned a few times in Shakespeare's plays, and they think perhaps it ended up in the English court through the Ormonds of Kilkenny, going over in the 1500s, and that it was a very popular song, and was adopted then by me. But of course, that's also why we have the music of the harpers from the Scottish manuscripts, because the Irish music was an oral tradition and wasn't written down. The first book we have published in Ireland of music is from the 1700s. So we really have to search elsewhere to try and find what we had in Irish music in the 1500s, 1600s with the harpers.
So now Eamon and I are going to play a little solo piece each, and the piece I'm going to play is from the Dublin virginal manuscript that we mentioned earlier. And this manuscript is of immense importance in the time, and certainly the music would have been heard not only all over Ireland, England, also Flanders. It's a collection of tunes from all these different countries, and sometimes they don't really know the exact origin. They even go, maybe a sailor had come off a ship somewhere and whistled a tune and it was written down. So it's a wonderful collection of songs that have been kind of arranged for keyboard. So I'm going to play you a short little piece from that.
Tunes that are more connected to Owen Roe's time in Europe. The first piece by Francesco Corbetta. Corbetta was the Jimi Hendrix of his day on guitar, and originally from Italy, but travelled to Belgium, and then was in service to the King of Spain. And after the peace between France and Spain in the 1650s, that ended up dividing Catalonia between Spain and some of it in France, that peace treaty. Louis XIV of Versailles brought Corbetta back to his court. And then Charles II was staying in the French court during the time of Cromwell, and Charles II was in exile. And when he got restored in 1660, he brought Corbetta to London, with fabulous riches and wealth. And from there, he came into contact with a lot of the Anglo-Irish lords, especially the Ormonds of Kilkenny. And now there is a manuscript of guitar music, and it has pieces written by an Irish guitarist or a guitarist based in Ireland, and Corbetta's music turns up in this. So this is a chaconne, which had started its life, came in from South America in the late 1500s, and was a dance. And was sufficiently risque that if you were caught dancing it in the streets of Spain around 1600, you could be banished from the kingdom or sent to the galleys. So it must have been fun. By the time of this version of it, it's become gentrified. The guitar was the kind of rock and roll instrument in the early 1600s, and there's various music dictionaries and things that give out about guitarists with their ridiculous facial contortions and movements but the young people loved it, and the young people of the court loved it, and when they grew up, they became the nobles and the kings and the queens, and so the guitar was received into the courts of England in the 1600s at a real golden period. One of those music dictionaries of the time has a quote that lutenists and guitarists connected to them spend a third of their time asleep and a third of their time tuning. And then the last third of their time playing out of tune. so much. That was that obviously followed into two more pieces, well-known Spanish pieces. And the last one, the Canarios from the Canary Islands, and again came into Spain and was popular throughout Europe. We're going to finish off now with a short set. And thanks so much, Brendan, when he first got in touch with me. I was intrigued with this opportunity to be able to play this music. We're both delighted to be here. And thank you so much for being such We're going to play a traditional Spanish piece, Catalan piece, and then the famous Lament for Owen Roe by Carolan, and then finish off with another Carolan tune, originally just called Air, but many of us now will know it also by the name Carolan's Welcome.